We've talked a lot about the right to protest right the way throughout the pandemic. In fact, there's been various points, of course, when different groups have protested. I think they've sort of had legal green lights from the police and the various places you have to get permission from. But there's always been a little bit of a question, are you allowed to protest during a pandemic, of course? And the right during a lockdown should be made clear by putting it on the same footing as the right to picket and the right to take part in communal worship. This is a new report by the Joint Committee who's called on the government to bring forward regulation to amend the law to make it clear that protest is permitted if conducted in a manner that reduces public health risks to an acceptable level. The report includes a draft legislation indicating that gathering to protest is not and never has been completely illegal during the pandemic, even under lockdown. Harriet Harman is the Labour MP and chair of the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Human Rights. Harriet Harman, good afternoon to you. It is a question that I think we've probably all mused at some point in the last year. Are you allowed to get out with your placard and protest?
Well, I think the answer is, in law, you most likely are, but in practice, you haven't been able to. But the reality is that everybody can see is it's just a muddle. I mean, originally, the idea was that all leaving of your home and going out and about was banned, except for things which were exempt. And some things that were exempt included religious worship under certain conditions, funerals under certain conditions, and protest under certain conditions. Then when we got to tier 4, the protest exemption disappeared, but the assumption was that you could still protest because you are allowed to do things, even if it means gathering, if there is a reasonable justification. And since the Human Rights Act protects the right to protest, then it's okay to argue that a protest, so long as it's done safely and with agreement with the police, could be a reasonable justification. But the thing is that, I mean, although I've explained it, though I'd say it myself extremely clearly, it is tortuous, and the government shouldn't have left this confusion. And the Metropolitan Police, I see just now, have just tweeted saying all protests in London are banned. Well, they're certainly not allowed to do that because they're supposed to consider each one to see whether it's reasonably justified and whether or not conditions could be imposed. So the police are certainly doing what is not lawful in London, but I think it's not their fault. It's because there's a lot of confusion. So I think what we've done on the Joint Committee on Human Rights is we've drafted some regulations that which would clarify this and say you can protest so long as it's subject to conditions about it being safe. And then that puts it on the same footing as religious assembly. And I think it's really not right in this country that protest is treated less protected than religious assembly.
But of course, well, indeed, put like that is quite correct. But lots of people, Harriet Harman, would say, well, hang on a sec, there's a pandemic going on. Lots of things go by the wayside, including certain sort of senses of human rights. You know, the human right to have medical treatment for some people has been removed because of the pandemic and various things having to shift around. The right to carry a placard to complain about the closure of, you know, your local scout hut is hardly going to usurp, surely, the importance of a pandemic.
Well, the European Convention on Human Rights protects the right to religious freedom, and that's reflected in the regulations which say that they shouldn't ban religious assembly unless there is overriding reasons why they should, why it can't be done safely, even on a scaled down, even on a socially distanced way. The idea is that you have to look at the circumstances in each case. If you're going to override important human rights, you have to look at the circumstances. You can't just do a blanket ban. And I think that's the right approach. Nobody wants anybody to be unsafe in relation to the pandemic, but they don't need to do a blanket ban. They can deal with protests in the same way that they deal with religious gatherings. And that's what the Joint Committee on Human Rights has drafted regulations. So the government doesn't need to stay up at night with their, quill pens scratching on the parchment. We've done it for them, and I think there would be general agreement in the House of Commons for this.
I can see those quill pens coming out of the cupboards as we speak, Harriet, nonetheless. In terms of protest, in terms of public opinion, I should say, it largely depends on whether you agree with the protest, doesn't it? So somebody say, yes, of course you've got the right to protest if it's Black Lives Matter, and somebody else will say, well, no, you shouldn't have the right to protest because I disagree fundamentally with another cause. And so it's quite difficult to sort of get public opinion judged on this one, because we don't like Extinction Rebellion clogging up the roads, but we do understand why you might want to show respect for somebody who's died.
But if you look abroad at other countries and you see where they don't let people protest because they don't like the protest, then we think, oh, that's a bad thing. That's not freedom. And we do believe in freedom in this country. I mean, above all, we've got to protect people's lives during the pandemic. But we don't want to trample on human rights when it's not necessary to do that. And if they can do it for religion, they can do it for protest, which is absolutely fundamental.
So it's possible to hold those two views. You know, a few people saying, hang on, this is hypocrisy, Harriet Harman. You voted for these lockdown laws and now you're whinging about the police enforcing them.
Well, except that the police aren't enforcing them properly, because arguably those laws do allow for protest. It's just that it's couched in such very opaque terms. And yes, I make no apologies for the fact that we voted for all the COVID lockdown regulations, because we don't want to give the government any grief when they're trying to save our lives from this awful virus. But actually, that doesn't mean we can't point out that there is a way that they're doing things that could be better.
Okay, and just a very final point. I know we are short on time, but just to give an example of that, it would be something like, okay, we want to have a protest. The authorities saying, yes, you can have one, but it can only be X amount of people. Is that the kind of thing you're talking about in terms of retaining the human right to protest while also understanding where we're at?
Absolutely. They could say you can only have 40 people. You've got to have 10 of those people being stewards. Everybody's got to be masked. Everybody's got to be socially distanced. And they could lay down conditions.
Yeah. And don't be too loud, otherwise Priti Patel might put you in jail. There is that as well. Harriet Harman, thank you. Labour MP and chair of the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Human Rights. I mean, thank you to Fee, by the way, for feeding in via Twitter that question about voting for legislation and then saying, well, actually, what about the right to protest? You kind of wonder, a lot of this, I'm tempted to say, and we didn't really have time with Harriet Harman to get further into this, would have come over what happened as a result of what happened in Clapham last Saturday. Where I think you had something slightly different going on there. I mean, what is the right to protest during a pandemic? Where I don't know where that leaves, Cheltenham, for example. Don't know Cheltenham because it's a horse race and therefore it's an enjoyment rather than a protest. And the right to protest is political. The right to enjoyment is something completely different. What if you get 100,000 people at your protest? And what if the police say, well, you can have it, but you can only have 40 people? But then 100,000 turn up. Where would that leave that? Surely you've got to have one or the other here, right?